So welcome to the 13th panel of Candyman and the Whole Damn Swarm. I'm your host, John Jennings, one of the co-organizers of this wonderful event. I'm joined by Dr. Courtney Baker and Dr. Keith Harris. And I'll do a more extensive introduction of them in a second. But this panel, this discussion is called The Art of Rumor, Final Thoughts on Candyman's Legacy. Before I introduce our illustrious discussants, I would like to do a quick land acknowledgement. This is the UCR campus statement, and we at UCR, which is the University of California at Riverside, would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla people, the Tongva, the Luciano, the Serrano peoples, and all their ancestors and descendants past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many indigenous peoples all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff. We are grateful to have this opportunity to live and work on these homelands. So thank you for that. So really quickly, I'm going to do an introduction. Let's see. First of all, we have Dr. Keith Harris, who teaches in the Media and Cultural Studies department with myself. Professor Harris received his PhD in Cinema Studies from New York University, and areas of specialization include film, Afro-American and Africana cinema, Black visual culture, and visible and the visual, gender studies, and queer theory. However, his recent research and writing interests primarily concern masculinity, performance, and genders as ethical constructs within performance and cultural production. Next, we have Dr. Courtney Baker, Baker, who's an associate professor of English at the University of California, Riverside. In 2017, she co-founded the program in Black Studies at Occidental College and served as inaugural chair. She earned her BA from Harvard University and a PhD from Duke University. Her book, Humane Insight, Looking at Images of African Suffering and Death, is 2015, explores the long history of African Visual activism. Her research focuses on Blackness, language, and visual representation. Her writing has appeared in The Root, Dilettante Army, Camera Obscura, and the award-winning volume, Black Culture Production After Civil Rights. So thank you for joining. My name is John Jennings, and I am a professor of Media and Cultural Studies. My work delves into Black speculative culture, critical race design studies, basically representation of Blackness in cultural media, such as comics and graphic novels, and I also study horror and also Afrofuturism. So, and I'll be kind of like leading the discussion here. So thank y'all for joining me. So I think all of us have a particular relationship to Candyman. This is, of course, a roundtable discussing Candyman's legacies. But first of all, I want to kind of delve into, I guess, like our first encounters or our first thing with the character, or even if it's a new experience, like things you heard about the character or the film itself. And I guess I'll start with Keith. I know the Candyman is one of his favorite films, actually. So.
You asked me like sort of first
encounter? The first time you kind of encountered.
I'd read about it when it was in production, and I was familiar with Clive Barker, and I was familiar with the short story, and so I was kind of eager. At first, I was a little nervous because it looked like it was like he was going to take this specter from the council houses in England and just throw him in the Black Mise-en-Scene and do his thing. But actually, when I saw it, I liked it because at least he and Bernard Rose, certainly for that period of time, took the time to actually do a modicum of a transfer. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't that they just threw it into Chicago, but they actually put Chicago onto the story and mixed it up a little bit in a thoughtful way. And it was probably the only thing doing that at that time. That was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Then just the whole idea of Candyman coming back and being this sort of sort of being in this community and sort of this sort of So it's almost like anti-hero and anti-horror because he's like he's the guy you call him, he comes back, he slices you up, but you know he didn't mean to. I mean he's already sliced up himself. And so I like that dynamic, and it was very sort of reminiscent of like you know Pam Grier's characters where she was like always killing people and so put in positions of where she had to do certain things. I'm thinking of Coffee in particular.
Mhm.
But yeah, that's that's my relationship to Candyman. Yeah.
Courtney, you want to follow up?
Sure. My encounters with Candyman, I'm going to be really mindful not to say it 5 times, even
Yeah,
though.
because it's very
does it-
tempting, right?
Right. Does it work when you're looking at your own face through Zoom?
I think that we probably should not test.
We can probably do that. No,
Okay, not to do that.
So,
because then the reflection would be what? Candyman?
So my encounter with the Candymans is somewhat belated, and I watched them in reverse order. But I think the belatedness actually kind of ties into what we're talking about. So I am, even though I'm fascinated with horror and death and crime, I am a huge scaredy cat. And one of my earliest memories is actually running out of a scary movie around age 7. So I think in some ways my entire career is telling myself maybe in the mirror, it's not real, it's only a movie, it's only a movie. So watching these films, yeah, it was really, was able to get a grip on them. Didn't run out of the room. And I was really, and also watching them in reverse order. So I guess I'm the only one here who's done that. So I can take that point of privilege. It was really apparent to me the ways in which the stories are building on, well, the latter story is building on the prior story, but also informing a prehistory of this story and kind of altering the point of view, like the difference between what is this story when a white woman anthropologist enters the space, and also when the white woman is figured by the film as the most valuable thing for Candyman, his object of desire. And then in the more recent version, it's a Black space, right? Black knowing, and this kind of by the end of the movie, it's the Black woman who is Candyman's most precious and most valuable object. So I thought there was some really interesting kind of inversions, a kind of call and response dynamic going on. So I like thinking about them together, and I'm just looking forward to talking with you guys about it.
yeah, I mean, you did bring up a lot of really amazing points about again about the legacy of the character. So I remember like when the movie was first advertised, and I was at Jackson State University. I was in Mississippi, when it came out, and I distinctly remember it came out the same weekend as Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. Actually.
Yep.
Which has become like one of my favorite, probably my favorite Dracula film, actually.
It is pretty cool.
And I desperately wanted to see that film. I wanted to see Dracula. It just looked spectacular,
Yeah.
And at the time, I remember that I was going on a date, and she was also a horror fan, and she wanted to see Candyman. So I begrudgingly went to go see Candyman. Actually, I remember this like it was yesterday, and I'm thinking the whole time, what is this movie? What is this Candyman thing, right? And in my heart, I wanted to go see Dracula, but at the end of the film, I was like, okay, this was pretty amazing, and like nothing I really encountered before. I want to say, like at the time, I probably was not as I wasn't thinking about race critically as I am now. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you're at a historically Black college. I want to say that I don't really think, I wasn't starting to think about the criticality and constructions of race until I went to graduate school. And I realized, wow, I actually am a minority in this space. It really politicizes you going from like a HBCU, which is about 99.99% Black, to like, a PWI, right? And so, yeah, I mean, it was like really visceral. And I remember thinking about like just how he spoke to Helen, like he was this kind of like playful, haunting
Mhm.
voice that he used when he first encounters, that Helen, the white female protagonist character, and he's speaking to her without speaking.
Right.
He's actually his mouth is totally closed, and it's in broad daylight. It's not at night. He's not skulking about in a shadow. It's in broad daylight, like
Yeah.
in actually a really scary space, actually, particularly if you're a woman, in a garage. What I'm saying? It's really
Right.
open, but it's also like, there's some potential danger there that I think men don't usually don't feel usually, right? And so for him to be in this this tall, elegant man, and you just kind of like eh, just hear this echo, it just stuck with me, and I think that's when I started stop thinking about Dracula as much. And I was thinking like, wait, who is this guy? you know. And I was like to that point, I never really thought about it, but up until that point, I guess we really only had like say, Blackula and her
Blackula. Yeah.
brother.
Blackenstein.
Yeah. Don't get me started. Okay. And so it just really stuck with me. It became one of my favorite films. And of course, I was a Clive Barker fan from actually probably too young,
Yeah.
And now, as far as like the new film, I have a lot to say about the new film. I was actually part of a team of people that actually built the syllabus for Universal Studios, for the community outreach program that they did with Monkey Paw. So I got a chance to see the film, way before it came out and actually sit with it for a while.
Mhm.
And as you said, Courtney, think about like just how these two films as touch points on the character and how we've shifted and kind of refracted and reflected, the character itself into like modern times, and even the fact that we had a black woman, a very talented, Nia DaCosta as a director, and looking at this character was just it changed everything about how I was looking at him. So yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna stop talking and y'all can jump in. but I was
Well,
like, yes, I really love these two movies together though. So
yeah, I like them both together. Just my own reader response to kind of thing, because the first film I saw, it was like one of the last films screened at the theater in Brooklyn, on Fulton Mall in Brooklyn.
hmm,
Um, and the theater was a mess. It was falling in. A mouse ran over my foot during the film. But I stayed just stuck through it. But in the first one, I remember I was just like, dude. I mean, he was so elegant, and so he's got that voice, and all the talk, as you pointed out, the talking without his mouth moving, and this kind of longing.
mhm,
And so there was a horror, and there was a kind of sadness to it for me. And not so much for Helen, but for his predicament, because Helen got to be reincarnated. He just got to be a specter. And so I was sort of saddened by that. But then with the second film, by the end of the second film, I was so into it. I was like, say it. When she's in back to the car, I was like, say it now. And then I did not have that energy or that response in the first one, because it was a much more I mean, I think the first one draws so heavily on just the history of that miscegenation, and of that predicament that he was in. Whereas whereas the second film takes what Candyman became and gives it a legacy, and gives it a different kind of meaning, where I'm not sad about his longing. It because he is, by the end of the second one, he's an Avenger for me. I mean, I'm sitting there shouting at somebody, sitting there, say it, because she kept talking to the movies, so I wanted to say it. But it was a very different kind of reaction to it. And also, uh, I was familiar with Clive Barker, but I stopped going to horror films because of Clive Barker. So and I went back just for this film, because I knew the short story, and I wanted to see how he would do it. But I think that they're two very different. I mean, I think my response is to each film is different, but they're two very different takes on horror and two very different takes on, I mean, horror, not only horror, but also like cinematography. I mean, it's there's a way in which in the second film, well, let me go. The first film, Candyman, the color palette is kind of flat, and he pops, he stands out, he's a giant, and he stands out, and and then there's all the sounds, the buzzing bees, and his great voice, and all that kind of thing. But the second film is very much it's a warmer film in a weird way. It's a warmer and colder because there's all that blue stuff that's going on too, and so it sort of elicited a very different, for me, a different participation in the viewing of the film. Because I was eager and ready. I mean, I survived Candyman, so I can do this. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe picking up on some of what Keith you said about, also I'm thinking about the differences in our experiences. Like I didn't see either of these films in a movie theater, which is in some ways increasingly, but hopefully not exclusively, the experience of film consumption. But there's something about that first movie that really almost demanded, at least for me, watching this as a Black viewer, maybe also specifically as a Black woman viewer, that I really wanted to talk back. And I'm really grateful to you guys for acknowledging my text. But I was like, who are these people who are just talking to this woman who just walks into these spaces while these Black women or Black men are doing work, and just tell her all your business. And I mean, it's interesting to me that that moment of implausibility opens up a space for Black audiences to kind of talk back to the screen and to say, what are they doing? What is she doing? Why is he like that? And I didn't feel that need. I mean, it's just a different vibe, the second version, the Acosta's version, where I felt like it kind of predicted some of my hesitancies, right? The function of the police, the whole discussion of gentrification, the ways in which there are, Black people aren't just this like separate monolith living in Cabrini Green or the South Side, or just happen to be in graduate school, the Bernadette character, but that are talking amongst themselves rather than just having it triangulated through whiteness. So it just gave me so much to think about in terms of like the topic of this panel of rumor, hearsay, the need for recordings, right? That in the first iteration, there needs to be recordings, but also that the second, the sequel, I guess, the 2021 sequel, also uses the recordings from the original movie, inserts them into the film, but also doesn't rely exclusively on that. The shadow puppets, right? So we have that, also just this conversation about art and what art can tell and who can interpret it well and who can't. The critic who doesn't get the piece, but then is really into it once the murder happened. And so there's a whole kind of story about spectacle and horror and where Black people are supposed to be in the art world or in the horror film world.
Yeah. It's funny. And you both of you touched on this quite a bit. Like, where do I start? So one of the things is like the way we enter into the film, obviously like the Candyman, and sometimes much to my chagrin, actually, because he's not a quote unquote real urban legend. He's a as Keith said, he came from this short story from Books of Blood by Clive Barker, and the story is called what's it called? The Forbidden. The Forbidden, and the Forbidden deals a lot more with class, right? With class. Helen is actually in these tenements in London, and actually it dispatched with pretty easily at the end of the story, So to take when Bernard Rose takes the ideas, and he kind of like maps it onto America. He obviously is like, well, you know, one of the biggest issues that America has is dealing with how race, the constructions of race, violence around racialized bodies that happen in racialized bodies. And this notion of the Candyman then becomes like an amalgam of different urban legends, right? So you have Bloody Mary, obviously. You know, I don't know about y'all, but you know, we would play. I would never, I would
The
never
one
say
with
her
the hair
name.
going down the drain in the
Can you say
bathroom.
it?
Is Bloody Mary the one whose hair goes down the drain when you turn the lights on?
No, no, I didn't think that's weird. You should check me
Sorry.
out. No, like what is that? No, Bloody Mary is like, you know, you would say you had to be in the mirror and you would say her name three
You
times.
say, yeah.
Yeah, and then she would like tear your eyes out or cut your, you know, something terrible would happen. So, you know, so of course you would want to play that. The other thing is the Hook Man, right? It's that's the classic urban legend where it's like two kids or two teenagers are making out in a car, and then they hear something and then they pull off. And then when they get to their destination, there's a hook on the door, right? That kind of thing. Classic, you know, classic urban legend. And so it gets amalgamated, you know, it gets kind of fused into another urban legend, which is like the construction of race itself, you know. So so he becomes, I think Jordan Peele referred to him as like the prince of urban legends to a certain degree. It's all about remembrance and, you know, not saying his name in vain, actually, too, which I think is a huge part of the second movie, right? So one of the things I thought I was really intrigued by is like how both movies really deal with interrogating and critiquing different types of institutions, right? So the first institution, of course, is the academy, right? And the second institution is obviously the kind of art, the museum space, or the art industrial complex, whatever you want to call it. You know, it's still doing the work of interrogating, you know, the institution. You know, so when we come into the first film, it's a direct like reflection. You know, everything's mirrored, everything's like reflected, and it's like you have this really beautiful like overhead shot of Chicago. Looks like Lakeshore Drive, right? The other movie, the spiritual sequel, so to speak, comes at you sideways, still reflected, but it's coming in from the side. You know, it's coming at you a little bit different. You know,
and it's really low at the beginning.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And then of course, once you finish it, it's this really seamless transition from, you know, from the entry point to the two men speaking, two lovers speaking. So you know, and it goes direct, and then of course they're going to the apartment, right? So it's a really like beautiful seamless transition. And it's interesting too because in our we were actually, just to the audience, we were actually having conversations via text last night, and Dr. Baker mentioned Helen of Troy, right? And I thought that was a really one, because Troy is actually the character in the second movie, and he actually introduces Helen, which I thought was so clever. I was like, it's Helen of Troy, you know, literally, you know. It's just really interesting things are jumping off with the characters, and then it's really difficult not to kind of map Candyman to like a gothic experience like Dracula because of some of the themes, like for instance, the reincarnation, you know, of a loved one, for instance, is a big thing. Like because in the original, in you know, Lucy is or is it Lucy? Not Lucy. For that, the character that's reincarnated, this Dracula's true love kind of thing.
Lucy?
Was it Lucy? I forget. We're not talking about that. Okay. But I'm just saying. But there is this notion of reincarnation, and that denotes something that's not finished. You know, that kind of thing. Right. But also too, I mean, the second movie in particular talks a lot about cycles. You know, and things that are tragic cycles that actually need to be broken. I'll speak more about that. But I wanted to just kind of throw that stuff in there and see what you thought.
I want to hear more about the tragic psychos, because one of the things I was thinking about was the ways in which the hysterical Helen of the first movie, like it's not a one-to-one correlation, but we end up seeing Coleman Domingo's character ends up being one of the hysterics who's not to be believed, right?
Right.
So many of these stories are about, I mean, kind of the tie that binds and what makes them urban legends is that they are not believed until they are discovered and authorized by these institutions, either
Right.
by the anthropology department that
Anthropology.
declares it valuable folklore,
Yep.
or by the art world that declares it valuable as some kind of document or testimony to the Black inner city trauma or something like that.
Or also by gentrification and by this movement to this why is Cabrini Green still there, you know, at certain points.
Right.
You can't shake it. And well, apparently there's Candyman there, as urban legend has it. But I was gonna say the what was I gonna say? Come back to me. It's gone. Sorry.
Now, so just kind of to reference what Courtney was talking about with cycles, right? I mean,
And I left out Anne Marie. I have to mention Psycho Anne Marie.
oh yeah,
Right.
yeah, that's right. Yep, definitely. And so I'm thinking a lot about the nature of haunting. You know what I'm saying? It's about trauma. Every ghosts are like trauma with a shape, essentially. It's kind of like you take the spirit of the person and you mix it with the actual inciting of, you know, event. In this particular case, we're talking essentially about a Black man who's lynched because of something as simple as falling in love with someone, you know, and this is, you know, the underlying narrative. And one thing, and I think Keith alluded to this too, is that we don't necessarily have like one Candyman. We actually have a system of Candyman,
Right.
you know, and it starts to speak to the systemic issues around violence, right? Which I think is really interesting. And honestly, like the second film does feel more like a superhero narrative than it does a horror story, because
Good
in this
point.
particular, because it's almost feels like the origin story of like you said, a dark avenger or anti-hero, you know. And even though some more horrific things happen, it's a horrible thing, but it's like the way that Candyman is deployed is really more in service of the Black community.
Right.
And it seemed like in the first film, he seemed like he was more traumatizing, even more
Right.
traumatizing the Black.
He was more he seemed to, he didn't seem to have, I mean, he had a legacy, but it was not in this cyclic sort of the sense of justice. It wasn't in that, it was in the trauma of what he was. So he was not really in, he didn't seem to be in control of his actions as vengeance as much as they were just, you know, spreading the trauma. And
right.
you know,
It's the nature of the thing. It's like, you know, once you call it, you can't put it back in a bottle kind of thing. It doesn't really have a direction. You know, as far as like the legacies connected to the first film, of course, you have Anthony, who is the child. So he's like the son of Candyman to a certain degree, because he actually spent a lot of time with this revenant, because essentially like Candyman is more of a revenant than a ghost because he has physicality, you know.
Right.
So he actually is not a spirit. He's spiritual, but he also can manifest himself in a very real form. So that's more of a revenant, you know. And so this revenant Candyman is kind of interacting with this child, and you know, he ends up becoming this amazing artist, and is sort of like touched by Candyman, you know, and didn't even know it, you know, that kind of thing. And so he's drawn to the mythology. One of the things that struck me, so you know, in the second film was like when it's almost like he immediately becomes, you know, affected by the folklore and by Candyman almost immediately, because when he's stung by the bee, right, in the field, the next shot is the bee is being overtaken by ants, right? And so I'm like, it takes a while for ants to find a carcass of anything. So I'm like, you know, he had been standing there for like a long time, you know, in this kind of fugue state, while this specter was actually overtaking him and starting his process of turning him into a living hive, you know. And the other thing too I thought about is because he would have burned up in that fire if it wasn't for Helen, right? In the first film.
Right.
It's like he's slowly burning, you know, he's obviously becoming a human hive, right? But he's also slowly like burning. You know, it's almost like his flesh is becoming emaciated, like a burn patient, which I thought was really interesting. And you know, and of course they have like little one-liners, like the first time he meets Coleman Domingo's character, he asks him if he needs a hand, you know, stuff like that. So you need a hand, you know, that kind of thing. It's really interesting. But you know, there was another part where when he's looking for when he's taking pictures of the the graffiti, and he hears that sound, and it scares him. I actually got a chance to talk to the producer about this, because if you remember the part in the second film where he's actually standing there and he sees a flash of light and he walks into that house, that's him scaring himself. It's actually him from the future, actually. So it's a cycle. Again, it's a big circle where he's actually going into this space and frightening himself. But it's just it's kind of brilliant, actually.
Yeah.
How how the characters, like, bending time, even like this idea of like lost time and bending time. So and also, again, directly connecting back to the legacies of the original film. Another thing I was thinking about too, with the Coleman Domingo character, was it's like he pretty much he dies in that laundromat, along with Candyman, with his Candyman. He actually never leaves that laundromat, and it's so much to the point that he becomes a professional cleaner for the of clothes, right? And he talks about this idea of being caught in a loop, which I thought was a reference to the Chicago loop, I thought, but being caught in like the fabric, and how it's so difficult to get the stain out, and how he ends up doing everyone's laundry, because his sister was like, "Hey, do my laundry too." He's like, "No," right? And then he ends up doing everyone's laundry and just staying there and trying to like fight for the community in his own really, really, devastating way. It's just to fight for that space. Anyway.
Yeah.
Sure. Courtney, you got your face looks really pain. Like,
No, I was thinking about the laundromat and the stain, and I don't know if it's too far, and there's a kind of a negative balance to say that Black people are like a stain and they're not going to leave, but I think that there is something about the indelibility, and that you can't wash away all the trauma. Like,
I think with most trauma, I think it was speaking more so about the pain and trauma, not necessarily the people, but
and that the environment and the land retains it, right? Like Cabrini Green, also in the first film, the condo that was supposed to be the project, but is now that you just scratch the surface.
It's a mirror.
You can't paint, like there's this narrative of you can't paint over and absolutely wipe out what's underneath. It's going to emerge, and that kind of comes forward again in the 2021 Nina Costa's edition, through not kind of utilitarian painting and not graffiti, but in quote unquote fine art painting, right? And the evolution of the main character's practice, choice practice.
I was thinking too, I forgot about the other tale that's actually part of this particular story, and I can't believe I forgot it, because we talked about the Hook Man, we talked about race itself, we talked about Bloody Mary. Forgot to mention that this is actually inspired by a real murder that happened in Chicago. That's the other thing. And so, which I thought was kind of brilliant, because it actually, like, again, blurs the line between like the reality and what actually happened. So there actually was a murder that happened in Cabrini Green, with a man coming in through the mirror, and actually murdering a woman. And there's a story in the Chicago Reader about it. And so, and actually there's a counter story about it, actually, where the author of that particular narrative spoke about what it felt like to have a movie based off of or inspired by their reportage, but this is actually an event that happened. And so, there are people.
So this was the first one, or both, or the first film, or
the first film. The first film was actually there was a murder that happened, and actually, as I'm actually looking for it, just so you know, audience, I'm looking for the for the citation, but it just dawned on me, just reminded myself that yes, that was actually like an actual murder that actually inspired a lot of the things in the first film, right?
So something that comes to mind is film theory. That's a weird sentence to have said, but I'm a scholar, so that's what you get. one of the kind of principles of horror is that transgression of boundaries, that even as a viewer, you're not safe. And that gets, I think, materialized through coming through the mirror, that someone could just come into your apartment
Right.
from another apartment. And also there's this abiding metaphor drawing from psychoanalysis of the film screen as
Right.
a mirror,
Mhm.
right? And so the horror is that something else, or maybe even you itself. And so I'm thinking about that incredible scene in the 2021 edition when Troy looks at himself in the mirror and sees that he's actually the monster, as it were, right? He is the Candyman, right? So I think that there's so much there, right? There's something there about crossing the boundary and the thing behind the screen coming out and reaching out and getting you. The reason why I ran out of movie theater when I was age 7 or whatever. But also the idea that the fictional world and the real world are not that neatly separated. So the fact that there's an actual murder that takes place, like that's, I think, what gives the horror film, and this horror film, some of its gravitas and its heft, like, and also that's how urban legends are born.
Exactly.
Out of folktales and urban legends.
That's right. That's right.
But
And
things that actually happen. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's also the gravitas of Cabrini Green still, because
Yes.
Cabrini Green was still standing when this film was released. Yeah, and I remember. Well, wait, let me go back to the guy coming to the mirror, the real thing. So that to me, that gets me to this point about that film, that everything was so self-contained to Cabrini Green.
Yes.
And now that this is based on a real case, I mean, that's just cheap. That's just shoddy, construction. And I mean, and it's doomed. I mean, people are doomed to sort of, what's the word? They do it to themselves in a way. Is what happens with that. Because on the other side, on the Gold Coast, it's the same. So weird to believe that I could have gone to a condo on the Gold Coast and come to the mirror too. Wow, that is crazy.
Yeah, I mean that's well, it's interesting because the part when in the first film when they're actually like, hey, and they push out the mirror.
Yeah.
It's really referencing this story, and I found the story. It's actually 1987, September 3rd, and I put it in the chat. But it's the victim, her name was Ruthie Mae McCoy, just like
I remember this.
Ruthie Mae McCoy, and so this is actually an actual event that is mixed.
Yeah. No, I remember this now. Yeah.
With the forbidden, with things from the forbidden. I mean, he's a gumbo of different types of ways to move through this environment. So you have the forbidden, you have the actual murder, you have the hook band, you have Bloody Mary, and you have race, which is one of the most potent fictions ever created, right? That are actually making these things happen. There's so much there, and as far as like, and it's something I kind of wrestle with too. It's like who is the victim? Who are the victims?
Right.
Man, right? In the second film, it seemed like people who use his name in vain, people who played this idea of like, keep your name out my mouth, out your mouth, that kind of thing. I mean, seriously, because the people that die are like, the kids in the bathroom who are messing around, right? And that's the first time that I think Billy sees Candyman and understands what's happened. But then everybody else is kind of doing it as a joke, except for McCoy, for Anthony, who was actually unknowingly the vessel for the new spirit or the new, protector or what have you. I think one of my favorite parts is actually at the very end of the second film where his partner has realized what's happened. The man she loves has been murdered by the police, and there's a literal shift from a white gaze to a black gaze. Go from like the white police officers giving her options, her two options. You can do this, or you can do that. And then she was like, I need you to put the mirror so I can see myself. Because she's thinking about the third option. Which is
And that's what I'm sitting there saying, say. Because
Right.
that was a different, that inspired a different sort of engagement with the whole thing
Yeah,
at that point.
Well,
she was sitting in the backseat handcuffed, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And I was like, say it now.
Yeah.
There's also a certain thing about like when Candyman becomes more of a system. Okay, first of all, like as you know, like the idea of stereotyping is about fixity, right? So the stereotype of the angry black man, the murderous black man. What the second film does in conversation with the first film is that there is a mutability that's built into this new character. That's built into this new. He's actually multiple bodies, right? Which gives him a strangeness and a very like gothic, grotesque fashion, where it's like about mutability of the body, And when you see the reflection on the of the character of Candyman on the police car, he changes into the different iterations of the character of Candyman, And then of course at the end we get to see the amazing Tony Todd,
right?
His face, younger, computer generated, but his voice, that beautiful voice, that Shakespearean trained voice, echoing the bees, Yeah. It's quite, I don't know, it's exciting, it's terrifying, it's sad and heartbreaking, and that this character must be an avatar of pain like that. But one of the things that I like about DaCosta's version is that she uses the same kind of method that Perseus used to kill Medusa, right? The Gorgon Medusa, if you know the myth, right? He uses a mirrored shield to kill. So he doesn't look directly at the monstrosity. He sees the reflection. He uses that as a guide to take out Medusa. And even though it was unfair, because let's not get into the history of Medusa, but but still, it's like they're coming in sideways. You know what I'm saying? It's like this refraction of the character of him, of how you deal with Candyman. And she films it the same way. You see the invisibility. One of my favorite scenes is like these subtle things, like the murder in the bathroom with the young ladies, with the girls. First of all, like
the black girl went
all the women of color left. Which I thought was interesting. Like no, we out. One of my favorite scenes is like you don't see, you just hear the cutting, the spilling of blood, and then you see this one bee come in from the compact, right? And it lands on the compact, and then its mirror self flies back into the mirrorverse.
Right, yeah.
I was like, I was so blown away by that, because Courtney, you were talking about the blurring. I think both of you guys were talking about this, the blurring of reality, and which is so evident and surreal in the second one, but in both, yeah. Anyway, so those are some of the things.
The other thing about the second one that I liked, and say horrible things about when you want to, but the art critic's death was freaking stunning. It was just actually kind of beautiful.
Oh, you talking about that amazing drone shot that they did? Well,
yeah, it was really quite beautiful. I mean, because he's not there, and she's just doing all over. Yeah. So
they're just some really good. I mean,
it's a beautiful movie.
It really is, and it's a piece of art. I love the juxtaposition of even the Black curator who wanted to deal with the trauma first, to like, let's put your trauma on display kind of thing, right? Let's look at it. Let's digest it. Let's consume it. And being an artist, trying to find his voice and all these different things, and trying to figure out how he relates to this space. And there's just a lot going on. And the consumption of pain through art is something that's really interesting, particularly Black pain that's actually at the front of this.
And that reaches back to the origin story of Candyman.
Yes, because he's a painter.
He is a painter. And his greatest audience is not there for his painting, but for his lynching, right?
Right.
And so
That's right.
there seems to be some commentary about how Black people, Black men, perhaps in particular, are valued, right? And what economies we're embedded in.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. One of the things that strikes me about that too is that, the taking of his hand, which is actually the way one of the things that made him special and one of the things that made him, powerful was the fact that he was an artist. And the first thing you take is like his hand.
Right.
And I actually wrote this fan fiction about his hand being cursed, like because someone would take that hand actually,
Yeah.
If you think about lynching,
Yeah, somebody had
traditionally lynching, people would take all kinds of
body parts,
noses, lips,
ears,
ears. Yeah, so someone took that hand, and
Yeah.
so I actually, was thinking, I meditated about the hand, like the hand of Candyman, like the rest of his physical body that's actually in the real world is out there somewhere, because some racist sick person took that hand when he was lynched, and that's just
Probably still has a hand.
Yeah, I can send it to you.
Tell me one of the things that I always liked about the first one, but I didn't really think about it very much. What's up with the bees? Because they open up, they tar him.
Yeah, so it's almost like a tar and feathering. There was an apiary nearby.
Yeah.
They thought it'd be a great idea to smear him with honey, and let the bees sting him to death. Essentially, he essentially is like, beaten and cut. And I'm sure like the totality of his wounds is
Right.
what killed him. And then of course they chant Candyman because, oh, it's so sweet, that kind of thing, right? So they do this kind of like staging of it in the second film, where they actually moved the location to New Orleans, right? And and it's like so it's retelling it, and there's a child that actually gets splattered with some honey, and says, oh, it's sweet, he's like a Candyman, and it's just like this kind of taunt that he's just projected onto him because of the bees. But that's where that comes from. And so,
but
again, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, please.
Here's the weird. Bees don't eat honey. Bees make and protect honey.
No.
Bees protect honey.
That's right.
And they protect the queen.
Yes.
So I feel like there's another way. It definitely, the tar and feathering, I think, is intended, particularly in the first film. But I'm thinking about protecting the queen bee it's something that the second film does. And what if the swarm, right? You're talking about the kind of restitution of Candyman as not this lost specter, but an embodied revenant in the recent edition. To think about the swarm as not actually attacking him, but actually kind of protecting him instead.
Well, but it's also an extension of him, because he opens up. There's a great scene in the first one in the garage where he just opens up his coat, and there's nothing but bees and what
real bees too, by the way.
Yeah.
That looked very dangerous.
No, he actually, it's funny, and I'm sure he talks about this, or early on during when you talked to Tony about it, but he negotiated like a payment for every sting, so because he actually had bees in his mouth. That was not practical effects. That was straight up bee. So that's something I was thinking about too. Is like, again, Candyman, the ghost, the idea of a revenant is a mixture of the different things. So it's like the mirror that that they used in the second movie, where he's like, they're almost like showing himself like, look how horrible you look, kind of thing, where they're taunting him with his lover's mirror, right? That's in the second film, which we're not, I guess maybe not dealing with as much, but also, like you said, the fusion of these different elements of trauma into becoming this monstrosity, this beautiful monstrosity, actually. I don't know, it's just, and as you said earlier too, Keith, I mean, he's not a traditional. I think that's the thing that stuck out about it. He's just so different than any other type of mythopoetic around monsters, and around. Yeah.
I mean, what initially when I saw it, what came to mind was Freddy Krueger, because Freddy Krueger was like, check it out and kill, but he was a child molester, right?
That's right, he was a child.
So I mean, you can get away that in there. But the other thing about Candyman is, and just to a larger sort of historical concern about Black bodies, this idea that you can just do whatever you want to this body, and you can inflict all this pain on it, and you will derive pleasure from it, and you get trophies, and I mean, and it's the way in which, like, this idea that Black folks don't feel pain. You can hit us out of head, we don't feel pain. And here it's so dramatic that, okay, they really think he can't feel pain, so they're just gonna have fun with it, tar and feather, lynch him, cut his hand off, and put it in a pickle jar.
Right.
And that was what was, for me, that was what was a major aspect of the horror of the first film. That this is what, this is what you think about people, in a way. And fortunately, I was able to arrive at that because of the work that Bernard Rose and what's his name put into transforming that class issue into a race issue, and not taking the easy way out, because they could have done it. I mean, they could have done it the same thing except in a suburb, because that's the class signifier for whiteness in horror is suburban. They're isolated because they can afford it, and then look at there, the poor kid that they drowned is here too. But the horror of the endurance of not his pain, but of their pleasure, drawing from the pain they're giving him. That was the horror of it. And that he didn't, and that even as a revenant, even coming back, he couldn't control. I mean, because again, he's not enacting vengeance. Away. He's just traumatized, and they won't let him. He can't die, I guess. I don't know. Whereas in the second one, there is this element of vengeance, of protection, of surveilling and taking care of, and a legacy. Right. But there, I mean, that was the horror for me in the first one, that he was just, I mean, just the pain that was endured, that he had to endure, even sort of after life. He's in this position of not so much being in pain, but inflicting pain when he's not necessarily in control of he's the thing that they call and comes and kills you. I don't think he wants to do that, not anymore. Yeah, I mean, that was a horror. Yeah.
I mean, and again, it's funny. I always see like things online about the difference between what's a scary film or what's a horror. People, I think, mix up the two. That a scare is like for a moment. It's like it's like a jump scare. It's like, oh, you're scared for a second, but then horror is the affect that you're left with. It's the thing that attaches itself to you when you leave the theater, or
right?
With you that you can't stop thinking about. That's horror. And so, like, when you sit with it, it's like you realize, like, this is a really, really horrific thing that's happening. And I think it's one of the things that makes him a very sympathetic, monster. And like I said, I call him a beautiful monster, because but he's become a monster because of the things that are projected and reflected upon him. And in this particular case, reflected upon them. And I don't know. I think one of my favorite things is the fact that they kept the theme of art. This artistic, rendering, the idea of using performance and art to kind of create, more of the story, like the shadow puppets at the end, where again, this is a way to show violence without showing violence.
Right.
And in some ways, it makes it more palpable
and lasting. For me.
It's just like the stories that we tell, the oral history that we tell, and the fact that he's enacted through speaking. He's spoken into existence. Right. That kind of thing. It's just there's so many layers to these films that it's just it's remarkable. It's remarkable, and I'm really thankful for all of the time and effort that people put into creating these masterful experiences. So I guess believe it or not, we're like kind of out of time. Did you guys have any final things for the audience?
Say it, Cody. Say it.
No,
I can't do that.
Definitely not.
Well, even like Vanessa Williams, who's wonderful. Vanessa Williams, her character,
Oh yeah, she was like, no,
do not say his name up in here. And she clapped. She was like,
Yeah, yeah,
do not,
yeah.
do not say his name. And I thought that was interesting because in the first one, it was about fear of his name. And the second one is about
Actually,
saying
knowing
his
it,
name
yeah,
because it's a protective notion. You don't know that at first. You
But
know?
also in the first one, those black folks knew not to say his name. That was their whole
Yes,
thing.
that's right.
They knew
Right.
not to say his name, and they
Yeah.
knew that Helen was Helen, as they say.
Well,
She was doomed.
well, yeah,
So
yeah.
she
She was
had to
doing
say
because
it, right?
she was relying on her white privilege to protect her.
Yeah,
And also
yeah.
really wanted that PhD really badly. I don't understand.
Wow.
I mean, it's a lot of money, you know.
How?
So yes, it was. Yeah, it's some different things happening there too. I didn't really, I didn't really appreciate the killing of, of her friend played by Casey Lemons. You know, there was a lot of issues I had with those things. You know,
Yeah,
so it's like,
yeah, but
why
that
is
had
it
to
killing?
happen. I think they weren't that good.
Yeah, I guess
Because
so. Yeah.
that's the black sidekick. That's if it's not Candyman's body, it's gonna go across that sidekick's body. I mean, I think of what's his name in that Clint Eastwood film where in the end of the film Clint Eastwood becomes a good figure, but Morgan Freeman's body is propped up on the wall in a
Oh
coffin
yeah, that's Unforgiven.
because he has to die and be a spectacle before he turns over.
Yeah,
And
Unforgiven.
yeah, Unforgiven, yeah. And she had to die, and
The
uh
spectacle of Black Death. Is what
yeah,
you're saying.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's like a metric or an equation. You know, you kill the black person, and then you are enabled. Then your narrative becomes one of oddly redeeming that black character. But
Interesting.
oddly enough, you have to kill the fool first. You know, so it's yeah.
Wow. Courtney, you have any final things?
I'm glad we got to geek out about this.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just blown away that we were able to put together an entire conference. I had a small part in it. Mary and Maisha, they did the lion's share of this amazing experience, and I cannot thank them enough. Again, congratulations to Maisha Lester on the birth of her firstborn, which is quite amazing. Congratulations. Yeah, I guess that's it. So thank you so much for joining me, and
Thank you.
I hope that to the audience, I hope that this was an edifying experience as it was for me. And yeah, I know that the three of us need to probably hang out more and talk about film a lot more. So anyway, thank you so much, and I'm gonna recording, and appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.